Welcome to the Regina District Industry Education Council Career Spotlight. I'm Brian Wright, and I'm with the Southeast Cornerstone Public School Division. Today we are talking with George Tsougrianis, who is a producer with Overtime Productions. Welcome to this Career Spotlight.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate you reaching out. Look forward to having a conversation with you.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about what your job looks like.
Well, being a television producer in Saskatchewan, especially at this point in our history, is kind of an exciting time. Television is one of those things that a lot of people are always interested in. Certainly, a lot of people are always interested in being in front of the camera, but there's a lot of different people that are part of sort of the behind the scenes. And nowadays you can go onto YouTube, Facebook, and you can get a good sense of all the different positions that are part of a television show or a film. A lot of times directors get a lot of attention. But the producer, particularly on the television side, actually can be a really interesting and actually very creative position. Typically in television, you do have a director, but the producer, just by how the nature of how television is made, often has a lot of say and a lot of creative input. And so um, I guess as far as myself, I've been involved in various creative aspects in television. I've been in the broadcasting industry for over 30 years. And, I'm fortunate to be in a situation now where I'm working on projects that are really close to my heart and that I'm really passionate about. And so producing is a big part of what I do.
So, George, you spent 30 years in this industry. What different roles and occupations have you had during that time?
Well, I didn't have formal education as a lot of my other peers. I took a slightly different route. Back in really started in the 70s, but certainly in my time in the late 80s and into the 90s, community television was a thriving, uh, really was a thriving television opportunity, I guess I would call it that. It's a lot of ways you kind of would look at it like today as the YouTube of the 70s and the 80s, where content was being created and your imagination in a lot of cases was the only thing that limited you. So I was fortunate in that I started my career in community television, and it was a wonderful opportunity to learn the craft of telling a story. And for me, I thought initially that I was interested in being in front of the camera, but I soon quickly gravitated towards essentially producing and directing. And so, um, I essentially was involved in a number of different cable channels back in those days, and it was just a wonderful opportunity. A lot of times you would do these. I remember so many times where we were doing these projects where, there was a 6 camera mobile and we were doing awards presentations and all of these. When I look at it now, really ambitious projects that, I guess at that point in my career, I didn't know any better. But, when I look back at it now, it was a wonderful proving ground to learn the foundations in terms of, whether it's understanding the principles in terms of how you light something, the different aspects in terms of when you're operating a camera, what are the different kinds of shots that you want to use. Again, all crafted towards the goal of telling a story. And I guess for me, one of the things that I always appreciated or really enjoyed was I really enjoyed the idea of pulling everybody together. Because again, television, even today, is a team sport. Yes, technology has come a long way, and you can do a lot as a single person. But reality, you still need a team. And so back in those days, a crew of, if you counted the people that were operating the camera plus everybody that was in the control room, you could easily have close to a dozen people working on the show. So the producer in those instances really is kind of like the conductor of a symphony, would be a great way to look at it. Your job is to kind of bring everybody together, get everybody kind of on the same page, and kind of help conduct the show. And in those days, I think for me, the thing that it was terrifying, but it was also by far the most fun, was doing live television. Nowadays you have your phone, you can click on Instagram or YouTube and you can go live instantly. Back in those days, going live was a whole different process, and you needed an entire team and a whole lot of equipment to be able to go live. And I can't tell you how many times I would be in the control room, and you would be counting down the minutes till you would go live. And when we got to that 1 minute point, you would have these butterflies that would just sort of surface and rise up. And I always had the belief that you could tell how a show was going to go within that first minute. If the show went smooth, then within that first minute, then typically the rest of the show would go well. But if you had technical issues or if things went wrong within that first minute, it kind of went downhill. And so the challenge there is, how do you recover in the middle of something live, right? And in those days, we didn't necessarily have a delay system either, so it made a challenge. Um, so those were great opportunities, and I guess I got to a point where I wanted to grow and learn and do more, and so I got involved in the independent industry, this would have been late 90s, early 2000s, and got involved with Mind's Eye Pictures out of Regina. Was involved in a couple of projects that they produced, and really it was an eye-opening experience in terms of just the sheer humanity that it takes to put together a television series, that has a multi-million-dollar budget. And it also first introduced me to the reality of all the paperwork that's involved when you're a producer. They don't tell you that part. And when you realize, and again, back in those days, a lot of companies would have these thick binders that were like, they're kind of like the Bible. So they would have all sort of the aspects of producing that you would have to kind of follow, and the paperwork that was involved and stuff. And I just remember looking at that going, wow, I don't know that that's something I really wanted to do at that point in my career. So yeah, I guess I have sort of this entrepreneurial spirit, and at that time, interestingly enough, in the early 2000s, online streaming video was just becoming a thing, and then in 2005, this little thing called YouTube started up. And I always like to tell a story that we started our own online studio in 2005, and when I look back at that and I go, it was pretty incredible. What we tried to achieve as a company back in those days is that we felt that there was an opportunity to do news in a slightly different way, using essentially your website as kind of your online portal. Streaming video was essentially the main tool, and it was kind of cutting edge for those days, and there was a lot of sleepless nights trying to figure out some of the technology. And we did that actually based in Swift Current, believe it or not. And so along the way, when you start to do something non-traditional, this is the one thing I couldn't have accounted for that I think is really important in today's world. When you follow your own passion, and when you start to do something that is a little out of the norm, you actually get noticed. And that's exactly what happened in our situation. The name of our operation in those days was Southwest TV News. And it was incredible, the opportunities that started to come to us. I remember my partner and I were sitting watching the Western final of the 2007 Grey Cup, and the Saskatchewan Roughriders won that, and they're going to the Grey Cup. and the Grey Cup in that year was in Toronto. And I looked at her, she looked at me, and I guess we both said the same thing. I guess we're going to Toronto to cover the Grey Cup. And it was that kind of, well, we're a media outlet. This is what we do, so we're going to do it. And I got to tell you, Brian, that was probably one of the more surreal moments in my career, is being accredited, being in Toronto, and after they won, being in the dressing room with all of the fanfare, all the champagne flowing. And it was funny because there was one time at that point I was actually running camera in that particular instance. I remember, I think it was Gene Mazinkowski had the cup and he was cheering and all excited, and I was rolling at the time, and literally the door opens. Who walks through it? But the premier at that point, which was Brad Wall, and they had this great big man hug, and it was just a great moment. And and I'd love to say that I planned that, but it was just being in the right place at the right time. And so yeah, that was one of the many fond memories. And we did that for a number of years. But again, I think when you're in this industry, you got to kind of look at the trends. You got to kind of see where the opportunities are. And we felt that we had kind of run our course as far as the whole news thing. And towards the end of the Southwest TV News run, we we felt that there was an opportunity doing more longer form documentary based projects. We partnered with SaskTel Max on a lot of those. But again, I found myself in the midst of COVID. There was just something inside of me that said, I want to do a film about this little place called Grasslands National Park, which from my house is about an hour and a half. And I was so interested in that place because we had been there for a number of different reasons, mostly corporate projects. And there was something that just kept calling me back that I felt like I needed to do. So again, like any good producer, I said, okay, I can't just go there and just start rolling camera. I needed to find some funding, so I did my research, and I ended up getting a couple of grants, which gave me the capacity to spend the time that I needed to, at the very least, go down there and live for a period of time and shoot. And I didn't have any plans at that point. Again, a lot of people will tell you don't do that because, again, what you want to try to do in a lot of cases is you want to try to come to, as a producer, your job is to basically be the tip of the spear from a creative standpoint. So your job is to kind of pull together a core team, if you can, sculpt the idea, whatever that may be, put together some of the materials that you will ultimately need, ultimately things like a budget, a treatment, the industry, they like to call it a pitch deck. So it's basically a PowerPoint that kind of encompasses all the aspects of what your idea is. And then what you do is you pitch it to broadcasters or streamers. Now, the interesting thing in my situation is that I didn't really have a clear picture at that point of what I wanted to create. So the idea of me going through all of this process and then ultimately trying to pitch it to somebody was kind of futile because I didn't even know what exactly I wanted to create. So what I tried to do is I focused on, okay, getting grants that were more focused on the artist. And so again, that's Saskatchewan Arts Board is primarily who that is, and the Canadian Council for the Arts is the other one. So they're a different animal, and they're more interested in trying to foster you as an artist. And so so I found myself there for living down in Val Marie for about 3 weeks, and ultimately I came back with a bunch of footage. I still didn't have a clear picture, but the one thing I did, Brian, that was really great is at that point I had gotten to know a couple of people down in Val Marie, and one of those people was a photographer by the name of James Page. And he lives there, but he has spent a considerable amount of time photographing the park in all different aspects, landscape, wildlife, different lighting conditions, the sky, macro photography. And so he offered to hang out with me a couple of early on in my process. And as we started to drive around, he started to say some really interesting things that I felt, but I just couldn't, I just didn't have that sense of how to articulate that. So, I remember this vividly. I'm in his car, I'm in the back seat, we're driving into the park. He's saying some great things. And I said, James, do you mind if I put a wireless microphone on you? And that was one of the like I honestly, it sounds so trivial, but that was probably the smartest thing I could have done, Brian, because what ended up happening is the whole film came into focus once I did that, because he started to just say these really great things. And ultimately the film, which is called Wild Prairie Man, ended up being about grasslands, but it was through his point of view. Now, the irony about the whole thing is when I look back at that now, I realize the documentary is actually really about me, or my perspective of what grasslands is
Right.
about. And again, this is where the creativity comes in, because I was hands on in that particular instance, where I actually did a lot of the shooting and a lot of the editing. But the end result was really my version of what I really wanted to create, again, told through this other person's perspective. Again, didn't have any expectations. I just had that calling, creative calling, to go out and do this. And lo and behold, same thing happened. I started, getting a little bit of press. We entered it into some film festivals. We got nominated in various festivals. We won a few. And then, people started asking for us to do screenings. And then all of a sudden, the little light bulb kind of went on to that point. So at that point, I had probably been doing this for, let's say, 25 years or so.
Right.
I'd never called myself a filmmaker up to that point. And, I remember we were doing the screening at the Science Center at the Kramer IMAX Theater in Regina. And I remember looking out, and it was a packed, whatever it was, 150 people. It was capacity crowd. And my thought was like, I can't believe this. These people paid money to come and see my film. And it was just like all of a sudden there was a shift that happened in my mind, saying, you know what? I don't care that we're in Saskatchewan. I don't care that I live in Swift Current. I don't care that I didn't have formal training in all of this. I have a story to tell. I have a perspective. And as long as you have those, you can be a producer.
You've had a lot of different experiences in all areas of this industry. And I think that's part of the key to being a successful producer in Saskatchewan right now, is having that breadth of knowledge in all these different parts of the industry. So right now, you're producing a show called Staying Wild. Tell us a little bit about that show, and what does your role look like in it?
So Staying Wild, first of all, it's about this wildlife rehabilitation center in Saskatoon. It's an amazing place. Their basic job is to save wildlife that in 99% of the instances have had some unfortunate interaction with us humans. And so we're just we've just finished season 3, and the premise of the show basically is we follow the staff through the busy season, which is from May to August, and essentially it's a documentary series. So our job in that situation is to tell the story of the animals as they're coming in, but also to combine that with the human stories that are also unfolding, because ultimately, you can't have one without the other. And one of the things that just is unbelievable, even at this point in the show's history, is just the amount of dedication. Imagine now you've got, over the course of the summer, they get over 2,000 animals that come through the door. In any given day, they could have easily a dozen different animals come through the door. And, most of them are in very critical situations. Unfortunately, some die. But here's the part that I still struggle with. They have to, they have to be really in the present moment, because when an animal passes away, there's things that they have to do, there's protocol that they have to follow. But in so many situations, there's another animal that they also have to care for, in some instances immediately following the one that's just passed away. So they don't have time to really grieve and think about, oh, what I should have done, what I could have done more. They're just going from, it's like the old, uh, your students probably won't know the reference, but for you and me, the old MASH television series back in the
Yep.
70s and 80s, which was based on, a triage hospital in the Korean War, where you're just literally going from patient to patient. It's very much like that. But the point that I also wanted to make is all of our crew, the core nucleus of our crew, are all Swiss Army knives, in that the majority of them have directed, they can shoot, they can edit, and they can even produce in most cases. So it makes the show better, because you can put on your hat in certain instances, so that, for example, when we're shooting a scene, you can actually put on your editor hat and say, okay, what am I going to need to properly tell this story from an editor's perspective, even though they're not necessarily the ones that are editing it. But but as you can see, the more that you can think like that, the more everybody's job becomes so much easier, because you're sort of anticipating what the needs are going to be. So my role is, I'm one of two producers, and so our job is to basically kind of oversee the show in all aspects. So that comes first and foremost, all the creative aspects. So that's the shooting, that's the editing, that's all the interviews that have to be done. Um, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens on the back end of the show in terms of the finishing, because again, when you're working at this level, yes, theoretically you could do a lot of this yourself, but we have expert people. Like, so for example, we have a person whose main job is to color grade the show. Now, again, advancements in all the different software platforms, anybody can do this, and anybody can be really good at it. But to have an expert that can dial in when you're working, in our case, we have two main cameras that are rolling. Plus, we can have up to 10 GoPros simultaneously recording. So now just think about that in terms of matching that, but also matching that in terms of color, so that, when you're going from one shot to the other shot, even though they're in different lighting conditions, you have, because all those things potentially are connected to story. Because if you've ever watched something where you kind of go, oh geez, that didn't look right, right? What does that do? That pulls you out of the story. All of a sudden you're caught on, oh, why didn't that shot look right? And you've now missed the last 30 seconds of whatever the story was talking about, right?
Right.
So that's a, and then of course the other part of the whole producing side of it is the business side. So that means, like, even so, in our instance, that means things like writing proposals. That's doing all the paperwork for the financing, because every year, it's like starting all over again, so we have to do all the paperwork associated with that. Each season of our show is set up like a separate corporation, so it's like starting a company in terms of the paperwork that you've got to do. Then on the back end, once the show is finished, then there's a whole bunch more paperwork that you've got to do. Shows that are over, I think it's $500,000, have an automatic clause where they have to have an audit. So you have to go through that process. And so here we are, we're recording this in 2025. Our first season started in 2023, and we're still technically not finished our first season from a paperwork standpoint, if you can believe that.
Just kind of mind-boggling, right? Because it takes that commitment that never ends. Because you've got a different company each year. So you've got company number one that hasn't finished yet. You're working in company number two. Company number three starts because you've got a third season. You're never ever done.
It truly is mind-boggling, and until like no one can prepare you for that. You literally have to just do it. And fortunately, there are people that can help you with some of that stuff. So in Canada, there are the Canadian Media Fund is sort of the main funder from a public sector, and they get their money from the cable companies and from the telephone companies. They contribute to that, and what that does is that gives all the Canadian shows an opportunity to apply for funding. It's not guaranteed, but one of the prerequisites is that you have to have a broadcaster or a streamer that is on board. So basically, how it works is, I'll use our show as an example. So when we put the proposal together, we put our proposal together and we submitted it to City TV. They liked the idea, and ultimately, when they gave us the green light, that essentially helped trigger the next level of funding that we had to go after, which in this case was the Canadian Media Fund. Here in Saskatchewan, it's also Creative Saskatchewan, so they're another important funder. Within Creative Saskatchewan, there's another fund called SaskTel Max Equity Fund that we also applied to. There's also a tax credit federally that we can apply for as well, but that comes at the very, very end of the funding cycle. So it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. And a lot of people are arguing how relevant it is in this day and age where streamers are such a big part of the industry. But I would also say to the students watching, one of the really important things is that it's so easy to look at Netflix and Apple and Amazon and go, oh yeah, wow, I'd love to have a show and produce it for them. And I would agree with that. But the important thing to understand, when you're producing a show for any one of those, you do not own, the big term is IP. You do not own the intellectual property of your show. So at that point, you're essentially an employee of Netflix or any of the other companies. And you may say, hey, well, I don't care. That's a good deal still. And you're right. Yeah, you get to work with people at a high level. But here's where it makes the difference, is that in our system, even at this point, you can still own things. And in our case, with Staying Wild, my producer and I own the intellectual property. Now, the way it works here in Canada is we have essentially leased the rights for 6 years to City TV or essentially Rogers.
Right.
But here's the exciting part. That allows us to sell it to the rest of the world. And as a producer, when you own something, there's where you can really make the money.
Right.
Yes, as a producer, you do get paid for creating the show, but the real money is when you own something, because then you can sell it. You can sell it many times over. And in our case, we were fortunate that we've got a third party involved in there, because again, I certainly don't have those relationships to phone up all the different places in the world and say, hey, would you like to buy Staying Wild? So that's where you get a distributor involved. And the distributor, their job is, because they have the relationships, to try to sell the show. And again, they obviously aren't doing it for free. So what they do is they take a percentage of your show. So if they sell it, then it's like a sales job. They take a percentage of it. And so in this calendar year, we find ourselves in the fortunate situation of having sold the show to National Geographic Wild, which is one of the biggest specialty networks, especially for wildlife in the US. So that is a huge win for us. And again, financially, it's a great win for us as well, because that is revenue that is being generated by the show that goes directly back to the producers.
So the revenue is an interesting part of this because I can only fathom that there's a feast or famine type of job. When you're busy, you're crazy busy, and when you're not, there's a lot of paperwork that you're not getting paid for.
That's so true. And one of the things as a producer that you're always trying to do is you're all like, back in your day and my day, Brian, there used to be a guy at the circus who would balance plates, and he would spin one plate, spin the next plate, spin the third plate, and they'd go back to the first plate and spin that, and then spin the second plate and spin the third plate. That is a great metaphor for what producing really is, because the reality is you don't know how long a show is going to last. So you've always got to be looking for the next idea, the next pitch, the next thing that you're going to try to develop. And the reality is it all takes time. You can't just snap your finger and say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to produce a show about whatever next month," because you're essentially trying to pitch to these to in pretty much all cases to these major companies, right? And so there's a whole process that you have to follow. And so one of the hardest things about producing is everything that we've talked about in terms of all the paperwork that you've got to do. You're responsible for the creativity and how the show is being written and how it's being put together. But you're also got one eye looking ahead and saying, okay, what other things that am I interested in trying to develop? And what are those things that I need to do to start having conversations, to start putting together a pitch deck that has some creative elements that I can start to have conversations about. And then ultimately, the other thing that's really helpful is, so much of this is about relationships. And one of the best ways as a producer to develop those relationships with the people that are buying the shows or commissioning the shows is you've got to go see them. And we're fortunate in that there are different ways that you can do that, but the best way is doing it in person. So, for example, in Banff in June, there's a big conference that has a lot of people from all walks of life in terms of the television industry come together, and it's an intense 4 days where part of it is you're learning about trends and things like that, but the other part that you're clearly doing is you're pitching and you're having conversations, trying to keep the wheels moving forward and developing the relationships. And that, as a producer, is if I were to look at it in terms of all the things you've got to do in terms of the show, whether that's the business part of it or the creative stuff, I would put this other part of building relationships equally important, because if you don't have those relationships, it's very difficult to get things moving forward and ultimately get a green light so that you can get a show produced. So that's a really critical part. And again, all this stuff costs money. And one of the challenges is that, yeah, do you as a producer spend your money, or do you try to find what's called development dollars, where again you're applying to say a Creative Saskatchewan is a good example, where you can get say $5,000 in development fee development money to offset some of the costs and the time, and if you have to hire somebody to create some of the materials. Now $5,000 maybe sounds like a lot, but it really isn't when you can look at how many man hours a person can work on. One anecdotally, I'll just mention one of the other projects that I'm working on is it's an adaptation of a 1994 best-selling novel. The author, her name is Sharon Butala, is actually from Saskatchewan. The novel is called The Perfection of the Morning. And as a producer, I approached her team and I did what's called an option. So what that means is I had to pay Sharon and her team some money to basically secure the rights, which allows me then as a producer to start to put together the materials that I need to ultimately shop it around, and the goal is to create it as an actual, adaptation for the big screen. Now, one of the main things that you need in that world is you need a script. Now, I am certainly not a writer. Even with ChatGPT, I would be hard pressed to try to write an actual script. So this is where you have to hire a writer. Now, the reality is, when you start to get at these higher levels, now you start to get into things like unions and paying people scale. So a union writer, for example, writing a first draft of a screenplay could cost anywhere from $50 to $100,000. So anybody that's listening that is creatively gifted as a writer, you might want to consider that, because there is great opportunities. And again, stories are never going to go away. But as a producer now, I've got to try to figure out, okay, how do I cobble together $50 or $100,000? And you also have to try to figure out, okay, this is a very specific, very unique um, uh, adaptation. I can't just plop in any writer. I've got to find the right writer that will know this material, and obviously they'll have to do their own research, but will ultimately write something that will then allow me to potentially attract maybe an actor or a director that will then allow me to take it to a broadcaster, or not, pardon me, not a broadcaster, but to a producer, like a Disney
A film
or
studio kind of
film
place.
studio. Yeah, a film studio. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. That will help move this thing forward. And so, there are so many different working parts. And again, we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, and those are a lot of different levels in terms of what you can do as far as a producer.
Obviously, the work-life balance for you is going to be a different kind of balance than it is for someone that's in a regular 9 to 5 job. When it's busy, how many hours a day do you work?
The word balance, I wasn't quite sure what that actually means. Can you explain that? Yeah, that is one of the real challenges, is that I don't have children. I do have a wife, and we do have a lifestyle that we like to have in terms of some of the other things outside of work. But that is a challenge. Yeah, you can work long hours. Like, it's not uncommon when you're like in the busy season. It's not uncommon to work 12-hour days.
Right.
I guess my thinking is, it doesn't feel like work to me. I mean, some of it does. Certainly, some of the paperwork does when you're sitting in front of the computer and you got forms to fill. I know there's probably people out there that enjoy that. I'm definitely not one of those. Uh, but yeah, like the idea that you can tell stories and get paid for it, and like when it's really good, when you have people that are like-minded, and that, like, one of the things that I really love about being a producer is that you are the one that kind of sets the pace. You are the one to kind of bring the people in. You hire, in a lot of cases, you're hiring the people, so you get to pick and choose who you want to have on your team. But the other part is really articulating the vision. Where am I going with this show? Why are we doing this show? Who is it targeting? What is the broadcaster's expectations, right? And bringing everybody together in that common goal. And for me, probably the funnest is when you are on set, because if I use Staying Wild as a great example, there are days where we're having so much fun, where the animals aren't dying, and the animals are being saved, and the staff is having fun, and you just kind of look at it as it's a gift. So I guess that's a long-winded answer of saying, I guess I kind of look at it as a trade-off. If I have moments like that, then those long hours are justified.
Yeah. Which is the same in any kind of job, right? Yours just happens to be a very specific at certain times, correct? What would you say to someone who's wanting to do this as a career? What talents or characteristics should someone have if they want to be a producer as a career?
um, See, now that's a really interesting question, because again, what's a skill? Is that something you have that is a personality trait versus something that you've learned? So But in terms of just strictly skill, I guess I would say being organized is extremely important because, again, because of all the juggling that you have to do. Yeah, that is definitely towards the top of the list. You have to be a very organized person. The other one that I would put at the top of the list for me would be curious. You have to be really curious because curiosity will lead you in directions in terms of possible story ideas and things that asking questions and having conversations with people and learning things, and that's all part of this whole creative process. um, so curiosity is definitely another thing that I feel is really important. There's a lot of no's. So determination is another thing that I think and determination in the sense that, okay, don't give up after the first no. Recognize that it's going to maybe take some time. And this is why I say why you need something creatively to balance it off. Because if all you're doing is banging out proposals and trying to pitch stuff to people and if you're getting a bunch of no's, it can be really disheartening. So I know in my instances, being more of a creative person, I need to balance that off sometimes. So in my case, a lot of times if I get stressed out, what do? I grab my camera and I go to Grasslands National Park and I shoot nature, I shoot wildlife. And I don't think about project, I just think about the craft, of trying to do more than anything, just being in that present moment, and it's really gratifying. And the irony is, more often than not, I'll come home with some great visuals that will then end up being used. Like we've used a lot of stock footage in instances for staying wild that have come directly out of those visits. So I think those would probably be the top three.
The other part of that I'm noticing, George, as you and I are talking here, is it all about the communication. Whether you're communicating with the other people that you're working with, whether it's with other developers, distributors, producers from the networks or the film studios, that communication is evident in the way you speak.
Yeah, but don't get discouraged because, again, if I look at my career, I mean, I maybe I'm a good speaker, but I mean, I didn't snap my fingers and do that. I mean, it happens as repetition. It's like all of
Yeah.
these skills, it's like working a muscle. You just have to keep doing it and keep doing it and just stay focused on, like, passion is maybe the other really important word I use. Like whether you're a producer or whether you're an electrician or a plumber, I don't care what you do, but have passion for something that you really want to do. Because life is, it's a cliche, but it's so true. Life is so short. It'll go by like this. And you don't want to get stuck in a job that you're looking at your watch going, oh, when is it 5 o'clock? And yeah, the really great jobs, you have to have that passion. And, you have to be prepared. If you listen to any of the A-list, directors or movie stars, everybody's got a story in terms of paying their dues and stuff, and that's just all part of it. But have that passion for whatever it is that you want to do with your life.
George, I want to say thank you very much for your time today. You've given us a great conversation into what it looks like to be a producer in Saskatchewan. It's evident that you can be a success of it here. Even though it's a small province and we don't have a lot of industry in it, people are still doing it and doing it very well, such as yourself. On behalf of the Regina and District Industry Education Council, I want to say thank you very much for your time today and giving us some information on this career spotlight on producing in Saskatchewan.